Margaret Halbrook sat on her old floral sofa, her hands folded in her lap, watching the local news with a mix of hope and dread that she could not escape. The sunlight of a warm autumn afternoon filtered through the lace curtains, casting faint patterns across the carpeted floor of her living room in Austin, Texas. She had entrusted this room with so many memories that it sometimes felt haunted by the past. Today was the 16th anniversary of the day Jim and their daughter Lucia had driven away on a weekend trip and vanished without a trace. Her mother, Doris Barrett, sat beside her, clutching an embroidered cushion in her lap. Doris's eyes were fixed on the screen, reflecting the same combination of worry and sadness that Margaret recognized so well in herself. Every autumn, without fail, Margaret paid local stations to run a missing person alert featuring a photograph of her family. Jim's handsome face, with his neatly trimmed mustache and kind eyes, smiling next to Lucia, who at 8 years old beamed with innocent delight. Next to them in the image was the bright red Cadillac DeVille they had driven away in on that fateful day in October 1984. The announcer's voice came in soft but clear. They were last seen driving a 1979 red Cadillac DeVille license plate, THB 143. If you have any information about their whereabouts, please contact the Austin Police Department. Margaret closed her eyes, breathing slowly, letting the voice wash over her. She imagined her daughter's giggle, the way Lucia would brush her hair out of her face before tucking a lock behind her ear. She recalled how they had saved for years, so Jim could buy that Cadillac, how proud he had been when he finally made the down payment. That pride had turned in a matter of hours into the start of an unending nightmare. After the commercial break, Margaret's throat tightened, and she turned off the television. The silence in the room felt heavier than ever. She looked at her mother, whose lined face held the weariness of someone who had been fighting sorrow for nearly 2 decades. Doris stood, stretching her back, and offered a small, sad smile. "I'll get us some tea," she said. Margaret gave a faint nod. She could not bear to look at the television any longer. Images and voices that sounded helpful only reminded her of how little progress had been made in all those years. Margaret rose and walked toward the built-in bookshelf along the far wall, each step echoing the weight in her chest. Her fingers traced the spines of photo albums until she found the old, leather-bound book she and Jim had started the day Lucia was born. She opened it gently, as if touching something alive. The pages held snapshots of their little family. Lucia's first day of kindergarten, her tiny hand raised in a shy wave. Jim's proud smile as he held his first paycheck in that very Cadillac. The 3 of them at Barton Springs, sun-dappled water behind them, faces lit up with laughter. Margaret traced the edge of Lucia's face with a trembling finger, imagining the softness of her daughter's cheek. "Where are you?" she whispered, barely audible, knowing full well her daughter could not answer. Her eyes stung with tears, but she forced herself to close the album and set it aside. The sudden shrill of the telephone made her jump. She turned and rushed to the kitchen, still clutching her sweater. "Hello?" she said, her voice catching in her throat. On the other end, a male voice cleared its throat. "Mrs. Halbrook, this is Officer Daniels with the Austin Police Department." Margaret felt her heart seize. "Yes," she managed to say. "I'm calling because we've just received a report of potential evidence found at a junkyard in San Marcos that may be related to your husband and daughter's case. Would you be available to come identify what's been found? We can have a patrol car pick you up in about 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Margaret barely processed the words before she whispered, Yes, I'll be there." Dial tone. "Mom," she called up the stairs to her mother. Doris appeared at the top, her eyes wide. Margaret clutched the telephone receiver in one hand. "The police found something at Harrove's auto salvage in San Marcos," she said, voice trembling. "They think it might be connected to Jim and Lucia. They're sending a car to pick us up in 10 minutes. Without hesitation, Doris descended the stairs in a few long strides, determination etched on her face. "I'm coming with you," she said. They waited in the living room, silent except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel, until the police cruiser's engine cut through the stillness. The uniformed officer behind the wheel introduced himself as Officer Martinez, and offered no idle conversation on the hour-long drive south. Margaret stared out the window at the familiar stretch of Texas highway, her mind racing with scenarios, some hopeful, some dreadfully dark. Doris sat next to her, clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles were white, staring straight ahead, silent in her own anxiety. When they arrived at Harrove's auto salvage, the late afternoon sun was dipping, low in the sky. Rows of cars in various states of disrepair lined the gravel lot, and yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze around one particular area. A few officers paced silently inside the taped-off section. "Over here," Officer Martinez said, leading Margaret and Doris through the narrow path between two rusted pickups. A detective in plain clothes waited beside a crushed red Cadillac. His face was neutral, but Margaret recognized the set of his shoulders, the way his eyes moved from her to the car. "Mrs. Halbrook, Mrs. Barrett, thank you for coming so quickly," he began. "Detective Reyes," he said, offering his hand. Margaret's legs felt weak as she took a step closer. There, partially buried beneath a mound of twisted metal, was the Cadillac. Its bright red paint had faded to a dull, rusty hue, and large dents ran across the hood and roof. Dust and cobwebs clung to every surface, but Margaret recognized it at once. She could almost replay each memory they had ever shared in that car. Lucia's laughter as Jim let her take the wheel under his watchful eye, the way sunlight had danced across the dashboard as they drove back home from a weekend camping trip. "Oh my God," Doris whispered, gripping Margaret's arm. "It's Jim's car." Words caught in Margaret's throat. She stepped around the corner of the vehicle and approached what remained of the right rear wheel. She had noticed that dent months before when Jim had backed into a curb on South Congress. His promise to fix it had gone unfulfilled. Her voice trailed off as she mouthed, Yes, that's his car." Detective Reyes watched her face closely before addressing a tall man stepping forward. "This is Dean Lamb, the Junkyard owner. He's the one who called us." Dean wiped his hands on a rag, face pale with regret. "Mrs. Halbrook, Mrs. Barrett, I'm so sorry. I had no idea the car was connected to your family. It was scheduled to be crushed this morning. I was in my office when I saw the missing persons alert on my TV, and I recognized the car immediately." His eyes flickered toward the smashed hood as he spoke. "I didn't know what to do at first, but I knew I had to call you." Margaret swallowed hard, memories flooding back. "How did it get here?" she asked, voice low with suspicion. "Who brought it in?" Dean looked away, shifting uncomfortably. That's just it, ma'am. I don't have any record of it being accepted. It's not logged in our system at all." Doris's face tightened. "That sounds suspicious," she said. "You say you didn't know it was there, but you also say you recognized it only because you saw the missing persons alert. How did it show up here without going through normal channels?" Detective Reyes lifted a hand. "Mrs. Barrett, Mr. Lamb is the one who alerted us. We have no reason to suspect him of wrongdoing. In fact, he's the reason we're here. Dean, do you know who brought it in?" Dean shook his head. "No, sir. When I looked over, it was already among the cars waiting for crushing. No paperwork, no tags, nothing." A woman in greasy overalls approached them, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I saw Reed bring it in," she said, eyes downcast. "Reed Carraway. He's the head technician." Detective Reyes's eyebrows rose. "Reed Carraway?" he repeated. "Where is he now?" Dean drew out his phone and dialed a number. After a few moments, he shook his head. "He's not answering. But he lives in South Austin. Here." He jotted down an address on a piece of paper, handing it to the detective. "He should be there." Detective Reyes turned to one of his officers. "Send a unit to that address. Bring Reed in for questioning." Then he said to Dean, "Is there anything else of Reed's here? Anything in his office, perhaps, that might be relevant?" Dean frowned. "He has an office with tools and parts catalogs, but it's locked." Detective Reyes nodded. "We'll get a warrant." Margaret stood silently the entire time, eyes never leaving the battered Cadillac. 16 years of agony seemed to condense into a single moment for her, the realization that her husband's final ride had brought him here, only to be crushed alongside countless other wrecks, was almost too much to bear. Doris watched her daughter, hand at her mouth, tears glistening in her eyes. Margaret's mind raced. If the car had been hiding here all this time, why now, and who decided it should be crushed? Could there be something else in this junkyard? Something that might explain where Jim and Lucia had gone? Detective Reyes placed a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Mrs. Halbrook, I know how difficult this is, but we need your help searching the area. If there's anything else, anything belonging to your husband or daughter, your identification might be invaluable." Margaret nodded, though her legs felt unsteady. Doris took a deep breath and clasped her daughter's hand. Together they followed officers as they moved through rows of dented cars and piles of scrap, every sound echoing in Margaret's ears. A crow cawing above, metal scraping against concrete, the distant whistle of a train. But they found nothing. No luggage fragments, no children's shoes, no personal items. It was as if Jim and Lucia had vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind only that empty shell of a Cadillac. Hours passed like lifetimes, and the sky turned from amber to violet to inky blue. At last, they found themselves standing outside a small, unassuming building that housed Reed Carraway's office. The windows were dark, and the door was locked. Officer Sosa approached Margaret and Doris. "Ma'am, Mrs. Barrett, if you feel able, the detective would like you both to come help identify any personal items in Reed's office. It may be the only clue we get." Margaret nodded, summoning all her courage. Doris nodded as well, though her face was pale and drawn. They watched as two officers kicked in the door, stepped inside and began sorting through shelves and drawers. Occasionally an officer would exit, holding up a small object, a wrench, a faded rag, an old license plate. Each time, Margaret shook her head. Nothing belonged to Jim or Lucia. Finally, Reed Carraway himself appeared in the doorway, hands raised in surrender. He was a young man, late 20s, with short brown hair and a creased brow. He wore a mechanic's coveralls emblazoned with the Junkyard's logo. "Detective," he began, but Detective Reyes cut him off. "Mr. Carraway, you're under arrest. We found a crushed red 1979 Cadillac DeVille at your yard that matches the description of the car your uncle called in this morning. We believe it belongs to Mrs. Halbrook's husband and daughter." Reed's face paled. He looked at Margaret and Doris with an expression that was part guilt, part fear. I didn't know," he stammered. "I mean, I did know it was a red Cadillac, but I wasn't thinking. I didn't know it was connected." "Then how did it get here?" Margaret demanded. "Who brought it? And why didn't you try to stop it from being crushed?" Reed swallowed hard. He looked down at his feet, then back at them. I was the one who brought it in about a week ago. An older man came and dropped it off. He paid me in cash, quite a sum actually, and said he didn't want it anymore. He left the keys in the ignition and just walked away. He wouldn't give me a name. He looked tired, like he had been through hell. He said he had no use for it, wanted it destroyed. I tried to ask for ID, but he just walked off. I thought maybe it had been in an accident, or that someone abandoned it. I didn't know. Margaret's chest tightened. "You let him walk away and you never reported it? You didn't think to check a missing persons database? To call the police?" Reed's shoulders sagged. I tried to follow him, but he disappeared into the woods behind the lot. Then I forgot about it because I thought, who abandons a car like that? It's totaled beyond repair. I figured maybe his insurance had paid out or whatever. I'm sorry, I didn't think. "So you never looked inside?" Doris asked, voice trembling. Reed shook his head. "Not until this morning. I saw the segment on TV. That's how I recognized it." Margaret took a shaky breath. Everything in her wanted to collapse, but she forced herself to stand tall. "If you saw it on TV, why didn't you call us then? Why wait until now?" Reed looked down, shame flickering in his eyes. I panicked. I thought maybe I could help cover for him. I thought, cover for who? Margaret's voice hitched. Who is that man? What does he have to do with Jim and Lucia? Reed's face lost color, his eyes widening. He swallowed, then answered in a whisper. My uncle. Charlie Carnes. Margaret felt as if her throat had been struck. Charlie Carnes is your uncle? She said, her voice hardly a whisper. Yes, Reed replied, eyes filled with dread. That's why I didn't call. He's unstable, violent. I panicked. Margaret's mind whirled. Charlie Carnes, a name she had never heard, but one that seemed sinister just hearing it. She thought of the older man marking the bag and slipping away into the woods. Could it be that Charlie had driven Jim's car here once before, hidden it in the trees, and now moved it back? And why? She remembered Reed's description, a tired, mustached man who looked about in his 50s. Who was that? Could that be Jim? But the idea seemed impossible. 16 years older, a lifetime lived under some terrible disguise. And Lucia, where was she? Why hadn't she been left with someone to call home? Detective Reyes stepped forward, breaking into Margaret's thoughts. Mr. Carraway, you're coming with us for questioning, he said in a professional but urgent tone. Reed nodded mutely. The officers cuffed him and led him away. Margaret and Doris stood on the gravel lot, staring at the detective as he approached. Mrs. Halbrook, he said, his voice gentle. I know this is overwhelming, but we have enough evidence now to pursue more leads. We'll start by checking out this Charlie Carnes. We also have your daughter's belongings to consider. As he spoke, an officer handed Margaret a small, dusty blue handbag. She took it with trembling fingers. The bag was small, about the size a child might carry, with a white trim and a simple clasp. It looked brand new with no wear and tear, an odd sight among the rusting metal and broken glass. This was in Reed Carraway's office, the officer explained. He said it belonged to his daughter. Margaret turned it over, running her fingers along the vinyl surface. It felt exactly like the bag Lucia had insisted on carrying everywhere during her childhood. A Barbie, World Limited Edition from the early 1980s. She remembered how Lucia had saved her allowance to buy it, so proud to have a big girl purse. She opened it, but it was empty. Her heart pounded as she held it up to the dying light. This is exactly like Lucia's bag, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Except, she noticed a small white ribbon tag inside, frayed at the edges as if someone had tried to remove a label. There were faint scorch marks around it. She ran her thumb along the tag, eyes wide. It's been tampered with, like someone tried to erase whatever writing was here. Doris leaned in, pointing to the singed edges. Who would do that? And why? If it was Reed's daughter's bag, why erase any writing? If it was Lucia's bag, added to the shelf years ago, how did Reed come by it? Margaret closed her eyes, breathing deeply, trying to steady herself. We have to go to the police station, she said, voice firm. We have to tell them everything. Doris nodded, tears shimmering in her eyes. Let's go. Now. Detective Reyes accompanied them to the cruiser, watching carefully as Margaret tucked the bag into her purse. I'll make sure you have a ride back to Austin when we're done, he said. But first, we need to process this. Margaret and Doris exchanged a silent look, one filled with equal parts fear and determination. They climbed into the back of the cruiser, driving away from Harrove's auto salvage, heading back into the night and into the unknown. The ride to the police station was quiet. Margaret kept her gaze fixed on the passing streetlights while Doris stared down at her lap, fingers working the hem of her blouse. The weight of the day pressed on them both. The crushing sight of the Cadillac, the revelation of Charlie Carnes's name, and now that blue handbag, twisted evidence of some deeper darkness. Margaret felt bile rise in her throat. The thought of the uncle she had never met somehow torturing her husband, taking her daughter, kept her from focusing on the road. But she held herself together, her mother's presence a steady anchor. They arrived at the station where Detective Reyes escorted them inside. The front desk officer recognized them and gave a respectful nod. In a small interview room down, a quiet hallway, they sat facing a long table. An officer brought in 2 cups of coffee, mostly cold now, and placed them before Margaret and Doris. The detective motioned for them to sit. Mrs. Halbrook, Mrs. Barrett, Reed Carraway has already given a statement. He says a man dropped off the Cadillac a week ago, paid him in cash, then left. The description matches your husband's car. Then we found this blue handbag in Reed's office. He laid the empty bag on the table, and Margaret's breath caught when she saw it again in the harsh fluorescent light. Reed claims it was given to him by his daughter from Houston, but he can't explain why the bag matches exactly a model only made in 1983 and 1984, when Lucia would have been 8. What's more, the identification tag was intentionally removed, burned with a household iron. Reed's explanation does not hold up. He paused, looking at them both with a quiet urgency. We have to consider that man who dropped off the Cadillac might have been using an alias, wearing a disguise. It's possible, likely even, that it was your husband Jim or someone posing as him. We need you both to think carefully. Did Jim ever talk about anyone who looked for him? Any strange person? Did Lucia mention anyone? Margaret's mind reeled as she tried to remember anything out of the ordinary before October 1984. Jim was cautious. He never trusted strangers easily. He always said strangers don't have your best interest at heart. He would help, but with caution. She looked at Doris, who nodded and pressed her lips together. Nothing seemed strange until the day they left. Dad stopped at that rest area just outside of Burnett. The attendant said they looked happy, laughing, taking pictures. That was the last anyone saw them. Detective Reyes leaned forward. Right. And now, 16 years later, we have a man named Charlie Carnes. He's Reed's uncle, who has an extensive criminal record for violent offenses. He's been elusive, moving from place to place, identity to identity. He has a history of charming people, posing as someone trustworthy, before revealing his true nature. Today, we have reason to believe he was the one who came to your home, on the day of the disappearance, pretending to be in need and that he murdered your husband in cold blood, then took Lucia. Reed admits he helped Charlie cover things up because he feared his wrath. Margaret felt as if the room was spinning. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. Doris reached out and put a hand on her arm. Detective, Doris said softly, do you think Lucia is still alive? He met her gaze, eyes sorrowful but firm. We have reason to believe she is. When Reed described that man who dropped off the Cadillac, you recognized it could be Jim. But we also need to track down Charlie Carnes and find out where he's held your daughter. That baby's been through horrors beyond our imagining, but there's still hope she's alive. Margaret's tears fell silently as she closed her eyes. We want to see her, she whispered. We want to be by her side. Right now, nothing else matters. Detective Reyes nodded and stood. We'll do everything in our power to bring her home. For now, we have you both safe. We need to press charges against Reed Carraway and start the search for Charlie Carnes. We'll also search to locate your husband's remains. We have location information from Reed that could lead us to a limestone sinkhole near Marble Falls, where your husband might lie. Then we can bring him home. Doris's hand tightened around Margaret's. Thank you, she said, and Margaret nodded, knowing that the days ahead would be the hardest they had ever faced. Later that night, after they had been released from questioning, Margaret and Doris drove back to their small North Austin home in near silence. The passing streetlights created fleeting shadows inside the car, reminding them both of the dangers that lurked just out of sight. Margaret reached across the console and took her mother's hand, as Doris managed to offer a weak smile of reassurance. They hoped that the police would bring their daughter home soon, but they both understood that the next steps would test their strength and their faith. Upon returning home, they found Reed Carraway's truck parked by the roadside. Lights off. Margaret told the officer on duty she would wait there for a family witness station and asked him to keep her updated on any developments. The officer nodded and escorted her inside. She slipped off her jacket and stepped wearily toward the living room, where the remnants of the afternoon's tea waited cold on the table. Doris sank into a chair, eyes closed, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. Margaret knelt before her, brushing away a tear with a gentle fingertip. "Stay here, Mom," she said softly. "I'm going to check on things." She walked past the photo album on the shelf, Jim's broad smile and Lucia's joyous grin, forever frozen in time, and toward the window. Outside, the night was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. She felt alone in the silence, yet knew that her mother's presence was just a few feet away, steadfast and unwavering. Early the next morning, the police called to say that they had located Charlie Carnes. He was holed up in an abandoned farmhouse, about 20 miles outside of San Marcos. They needed Margaret and Doris's help to confirm that the young woman in custody was indeed Lucia. Fear mixed with relief in Margaret's chest as she and her mother climbed into the back seat of another patrol car, leaving Reed Carraway's truck where it was. The drive was short, but felt endless. Each bump in the road brought back memories of the day 16 years ago when Jim had driven over the same stretch of pavement, hand on the wheel, Lucia in the back seat laughing as they chased each other to the front. "Do you think she'll remember us?" Doris asked, voice quiet. Margaret shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "I don't know, Mom, but we have to try." When they arrived at the farmhouse, its paint peeling, windows boarded up, a fallen sign half swallowed by weeds, an unsettling quiet hung in the air. Two uniformed officers led them down a rickety porch and into a dimly lit living room. The place smelled of damp wood and something darker, something that made Margaret's stomach twist. "She's in the back," a female officer said, stepping aside. Margaret and Doris followed her, and at the end of a narrow hallway they found Lucia, though she no longer looked like the little girl in their memories. She was grown now, a thin woman in her mid-20s, wearing simple pajama pants and a tattered blouse. Her hair fell in loose, tangled waves around her shoulders, and her eyes were empty, unfocused. Margaret's breath caught. "Lucia," she whispered, voice trembling. "It's Mom. It's Grandma." Lucia's gaze shifted lazily toward them, but there was no spark of recognition. The only sign of awareness was a slight blink, as if she were peering through a thick fog. Margaret knelt before her daughter, holding out both hands. "It's us, sweet girl," she said, her own tears spilling. "We found you. We've come to bring you home." Lucia stared, blinking again, but remained still as a statue. A nurse stepped forward, offering a gentle but firm arm to Doris. "Mrs. Halbrook, she's not speaking yet. We need to get her medical evaluation started to see what we can do to help her recover mentally and physically." Margaret nodded, reluctantly releasing her daughter's hand. As she was guided away down the hallway, her mind raced. 16 years was an eternity to a child's mind. What unspeakable things must Lucia have endured? She wanted to stay, to beg her daughter to remember, but she knew that at that moment words would not break through the barrier of trauma. She had to trust the professionals to begin the healing process. Detective Morales arrived not long afterward, looking weary but determined. He found Margaret in a small waiting room. "Mrs. Halbrook, I want you to know she's physically unharmed, aside from some signs of malnourishment and dehydration. She's in stable condition and under the care of specialists. We'll do everything we can to help her. In the meantime, I have some information you need to hear." Margaret braced herself. The detective inhaled deeply and began to speak. "It appears that 16 years ago, on the night of October 12, 1984, your husband stopped at a rest area near Marble Falls. He offered a ride to a man who claimed to be traveling alone, needing help after his own car broke down. That man was Charlie Carnes. He had convinced your husband to let him tag along. Jim never suspected what was coming. Later that night, based on information Reed provided, Charlie drugged Jim's coffee after they left a diner together. Once Lucia was asleep, he strangled Jim in the motel bathroom. He told Lucia that her father had been taken to the hospital after an accident, weaving a lie quickly. She never questioned it, because she trusted the man he called Uncle Charlie. Reed, at 10 years old, believed in his uncle's strength and accepted Charlie's comforting lies. Charlie pretended to be a family friend, a trustworthy relative. He took Lucia away, kept her hidden, telling her her mother was unreachable. He moved from town to town, forging documents to change Lucia's name to Samantha, and destroying anything that could lead back to her original identity. He raised her in isolation, controlling every aspect of her life, teaching her to obey when he demanded something. Margaret felt sick, tears pooling in her eyes. She could barely process what she was hearing. "And Jim's body?" she managed. "The coroner's office has reason to believe your husband's remains are in a limestone sinkhole near Burnett, not far from where he thought he had picked up that man. We're planning a search team to recover him and bring him home." The detective paused. "We found the Cadillac where Charlie had hidden it so it wouldn't be discovered. He and Reed moved it several times before finally trying to crush it this week. That's when the junkyard owner recognized it." Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, struggling to breathe. "So he's really gone? Jim is gone?" Detective Morales knelt beside her and squeezed her hand. "I'm so sorry. We'll recover his remains, and you can have closure with a proper burial. Right now, our focus is Lucia. She doesn't know who she is yet, but with time, there's hope she will remember. I know it's hard." Margaret's tears fell freely. "All this time, we thought we lost her forever. We didn't know. We didn't know she was right there somewhere, calling us Mom and Dad, and now she's scared and we have to help her." Detective Morales nodded. "You two need rest too. We'll coordinate with the hospital staff and keep you informed. Margie," he said, using her nickname, "stay strong for your daughter. She'll need you more than ever." Margaret wiped at her tears with the back of her hand. "Thank you," she whispered. She and Doris followed a nurse back down the hall to Lucia's private room, which was quiet except for the hum of medical equipment. Lucia lay in a hospital bed covered with a soft white blanket. She stared at the ceiling, fingers wrapped tightly around the edge of the sheet. Margaret approached slowly. "Lucia," she said gently, sitting down on the edge of the bed. "It's me, Mom. We're here now." She lifted her daughter's hand and held it against her cheek. For a moment, Lucia's eyes met hers, but then her gaze drifted away. She looked fragile, as if her spirit had been broken alongside her body. Margaret stroked her daughter's hair, tears soaking the pillow. "You're safe now. I'm here. And Grandma's here." She glanced at Doris, who gave a small nod, tears streaming down her face. The nurse stepped outside, leaving them alone. Margaret held Lucia's hand and spoke softly about memories from her childhood, about how she used to sing a lullaby every night, how Lucia learned to ride a bike in the cul-de-sac, how she once complained that a stuffed animal was too babyish, and insisted on having the Barbie bag instead. She told Lucia how proud Jim had been of her first day at school, how he had taken pictures and made a scrapbook page just for her. Margaret watched her daughter's chest rise and fall, and after what felt like an eternity, she whispered, "I miss you, baby. I missed you so much." For a long moment, there was no response. Then Lucia's eyes flickered. Her fingers tightened around Margaret's hand. "Daddy?" she whispered, voice raspy. Margaret's heart swelled with joy and relief. "Yes, sweetheart," she breathed, tears of hope streaming down her cheeks. "He's with you in your heart, always. We'll bring Daddy home." Doris joined her at the bedside, putting a gentle arm around Margaret's shoulders. The three women stayed like that as the sun rose higher, streaming through the small window, bathing them in warm light. Margaret realized in that moment that their journey was far from over. Lucia's long road to recovery would be filled with therapy, with rebuilding trust, with teaching her who she had been before those 16 years of captivity. And Margaret and Doris would be there every step of the way, helping her piece together memories that had been suppressed, helping her find joy in simple things again like drawing, reading, or holding a doll without fear. Over the next few days, the police recovered Jim's remains from that limestone sinkhole and buried him with a small private service under a willow tree in Austin's Sunset Memorial Park. Margaret and Doris stood beside his coffin as it was, lowered into the earth, clutching each other's hands, knowing that a piece of their sorrow would finally lie to rest. They placed a single white rose on top and whispered goodbye, feeling a sense of closure mingled with heartbreak. Meanwhile, Lucia, no longer called Samantha, remained in the hospital's psychiatric ward. She underwent examinations to assess her physical health and to gauge the psychological trauma of the 16 years she had lost. She struggled to find words, often staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. But at night, when Margaret sat by her bedside, reading stories or singing lullabies from her childhood, Lucia listened. She began to hum along quietly, an echo of a voice that had been silenced for too long. Margaret would smile through her, tears feeling hope stir in her heart. This was the first sign that her daughter's spirit was returning. One afternoon, as Margaret sat silently watching the Texans play on the small hospital television, Lucia reached over and took her mother's hand. "Mom," she said, voice small. "I remember you." Margaret's heart stopped for a moment. "I love you so much," she whispered, hugging her daughter close. "I'm here, baby. I'm never leaving you again." The months that followed were filled with appointments, counseling sessions, medical checkups, meetings with detectives. Charlie Carnes pleaded guilty to kidnapping, murder, and other charges, eliminating the need for a lengthy trial, and was sentenced to life in prison, without possibility of parole. Reed Carraway cooperated fully, testifying against his uncle in exchange for a reduced sentence, though he faced charges himself for accessory to kidnapping and obstruction of justice. Micah Carraway, Reed's father, who had risked his life to save Margaret at the farmhouse, eventually recovered from his injuries. He was released from the hospital weeks later, and though he and Margaret had begun as strangers bound by tragedy, they found a quiet kinship, two souls who had known what it meant to protect the innocent when no one else could. Lucia moved in, with Margaret and Doris, and for the first time in 16 years, the small house in North Austin felt like home again. The living room, once a place of ritualized grief, transformed into a place of healing laughter. Lucia relearned simple pleasures, playing board games with her grandmother, picking out new dresses to match her revived identity, exploring books and music she had never known existed. Margaret found a measure of peace in each smile that flickered across Lucia's face. Though the road to recovery was long, and there were days when Lucia retreated into silence, these moments of connection grew more frequent. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table eating spaghetti, Lucia's favorite, Doris raised her glass in a quiet toast. "To memory," she said, smiling through tears, "and to the love that found our family again." Margaret and Lucia clinked their glasses with hers, and for the first time since that autumn evening 16 years ago, they felt that the darkness might finally be behind them. In the years that followed, Margaret took to writing down the story of their family's ordeal, the disappearance, the 16 years of endless searching, the unimaginable discovery in that junkyard, and the miraculous return of her daughter. She wrote with simple, honest words, hoping that sharing their story might give hope to other families who had lost loved ones. She never used flowery language or dramatic flair. She simply wrote as a mother who had known both the deepest despair and the brightest relief. The pages brimmed with human details. The way Lucia had once covered her eyes in fear, the softness of her laughter upon recognizing a childhood song, the tears Margaret shed when she first heard her daughter say "Daddy" again. She wrote about the kindness of strangers like Dean Lamb's fleeting regret and Micah Carraway's courageous intervention, as well as the cruel deception of Charlie Carnes, who had twisted their lives so horribly. And through it all, she wrote about hope, how she had clung to the belief that her daughter was alive, how each small clue, an unregistered car, a battered handbag, had ignited that hope, and how it had finally guided them back to one another. Tonight, 16 years and a few weeks after the day their family fractured, Margaret stood in that same living room, now filled with photographs. A framed picture of Lucia's 18th birthday, a family portrait with Micah standing beside them, and another photo of the gravestone where Jim rested beneath the willow tree. Soft music played in the background, Lucia's favorite childhood lullaby, and the room held the gentle glow of evening light. Margaret looked at her daughter, now a bright young woman, softly humming along to the tune, and felt a surge of gratitude so deep it choked her. They had been through hell and back, but they were together again. Margaret closed her eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the warmth of her daughter's hand in hers and the steady presence of her mother beside her. In that moment, she knew that some wounds never fully healed, but some miracles were worth every tear. As Lucia took Margaret's hand and led her to the piano in the corner, Margaret allowed herself to believe, for the first time in 16 years, that life could be simple again, filled not with dread and unanswered questions, but with the quiet beauty of a family reunited.